The morning Janet Harry found the burner phone, she was just looking for the television remote. It had been one of those ordinary Sunday mornings, coffee brewing, sunlight slanting through the kitchen blinds, the kind of quiet domestic peace she had spent 12 years building with Joshua Harry. She found the phone tucked beneath a sofa cushion, small and black and cheap, the kind that costs $30 at a gas station and leaves no trail. Her hands were steady when she picked it up. Her hands were always steady. 23 years as a forensic accountant had trained her to keep her hands steady while her mind ran very fast in very dark directions. She pressed the power button. It came on immediately. No password. The most recent message thread was labeled simply ×M, and the last message, sent at 2:14 the previous morning, read, "She still doesn't know. We're still on track. Just be patient, baby. A few more weeks and it's just us." Janet read the message twice. Then she set the phone carefully back under the cushion, exactly where she'd found it, walked to the kitchen, and poured herself a second cup of coffee. She needed to think, and Janet Harry had always done her best thinking when no one knew she was thinking at all. She and Joshua had met at a charity gala in Kampala 15 years ago, back when he was a rising civil engineer with a bright smile and strong hands, and a way of listening that made a woman feel like she was the only person in any room. She had been 31, already accomplished, already independent, a senior analyst at a firm she'd worked her way into through 12-hour days, and a meticulous attention to numbers that others found intimidating. She hadn't been looking for anyone. That was what she told her mother, her sister, her friend Brenda, who had dragged her to the event in a silk dress that cost more than her first month's rent. She hadn't been looking. Joshua had simply appeared beside her at the buffet, made a joke about the overcrowded prawn skewers, and 2 hours later, they were still talking. He called the next morning. He brought her yellow flowers on the second date because he had remembered, from something she'd mentioned briefly, that yellow was her favorite color. He was thoughtful in that specific, attentive way that feels, in the beginning, like being truly known. They married after 2 years. It was a good wedding, full of people who loved them, and Janet remembers thinking, standing in that church, that she had been right to take her time. She had chosen carefully. She had chosen well. What she did not register at the time was that within 18 months of the wedding, she had stopped seeing most of those people. Not dramatically. Not because Joshua ever said times don't see them. It happened slowly, the way all careful erosions happen, a comment here, a raised eyebrow there. "Your friend Brenda is a bit much, don't you think? She's never really supported us. Your sister means well, but she's always stirring something up." He never forbade. He merely expressed his preferences quietly and consistently, until her world had narrowed to fit inside the shape of him. She told herself it was natural. Couples grow inward. It's what marriage is. There were other things she told herself. She told herself that his habit of reviewing her bank statements was practical. They were building financial plans together, weren't they? She told herself that the weeks he disappeared for work conferences that left no paper trail were simply the nature of a man who operated at his level. She told herself that when he looked at her, sometimes with a certain flatness in his eyes, a kind of evaluating blankness, it was just tiredness. He was a busy man. She told herself these things because she was in love, and because she was smart enough to know that love makes everyone a little irrational, and she trusted herself to eventually see clearly if there was something truly wrong. She trusted herself. It was the one thing Joshua had never managed to take. She had first noticed the financial irregularities 4 months before she found the phone. It was a small thing, a series of withdrawals from a joint account, each just below the threshold that would trigger automatic reporting, each spaced exactly 11 days apart. She had seen this pattern before in her professional life. She recognized it the way a doctor recognizes a heartbeat that's slightly wrong, not alarming on its surface, but specific, deliberate, the mark of someone who knows exactly what they are doing. She had started quietly pulling records. She had said nothing. She had kept her hands steady and her face calm, and she had built, over 4 months, a picture of a man who had been systematically moving their shared assets into accounts she didn't know existed. She was 3 weeks from having the complete picture when she found the burner phone. Now she understood the timeline. A few more weeks. He was waiting for something. He needed a few more weeks. Janet Harry spent that Sunday not panicking. She spent it planning. She called Brenda first, Brenda, who Joshua had quietly exiled from their lives, who answered on the second ring and said nothing dramatic when Janet explained, just said, "Time's okay." "Okay. What do you need?" She called her lawyer next, a woman named Grace Tendo she had known professionally for years, who listened carefully and said she could file within the week if Janet had what she described. She called her sister, who wept briefly and then got practical. By Sunday evening, Janet had 3 people who knew everything and a plan that Joshua Harry would not see coming, because Joshua Harry had spent 12 years underestimating his wife. He had looked at her steady hands and her careful face and her accommodating silence, and he had decided she was manageable. He had been catastrophically wrong. On Tuesday, 3 days after she found the phone, a woman showed up at their front gate. She was young, early 20s, and visibly, unmistakably pregnant. Perhaps 6 months. She was standing there with one small bag and an expression that mixed defiance and terror in equal measure. Her name, Janet would learn, was Miriam. She had met Joshua 18 months ago. He had told her he was in the process of divorcing an emotionally cold wife. He had promised her a future. He had, in the past week, stopped returning her calls. She had come because she had nowhere else to go. She had come because she was 6 months pregnant and frightened, and the man who had promised to take care of her had gone silent. Janet opened the gate. What happened next was the thing that would be reported, discussed, quoted, and shared across every platform for the following months. But the people who described it as a power move or a strategy were missing the truth of it. Janet opened the gate because she looked at Miriam and saw a young woman who had been lied to, who was carrying a child who had done nothing wrong, who was standing alone at a stranger's gate because the man who had made her promises had run out of use for her. She opened the gate because she was not angry at Miriam. She was furious at Joshua, and there is a profound difference. She brought Miriam inside. She made her tea. She sat across from her at the kitchen table and said, very calmly, "Tell me everything he told you. I'll tell you what was true." Miriam stared at her for a long time. Then she started talking. By the time Joshua came home that evening, Janet had moved Miriam into the guest bedroom and learned the full architecture of his deception. The story Joshua had told Miriam was detailed and practiced the cold wife who refused intimacy, the dead marriage he was legally extricating himself from, the plan to start fresh. What Miriam hadn't known was that Joshua had been simultaneously courting 3 other women, that the divorce proceedings he'd referenced were fictional, and that he had recently taken out a substantial additional life insurance policy on Janet, significantly increasing the payout in the event of accidental death without telling her. Miriam had not known about the insurance policy. When Janet showed her the document she had pulled as part of her financial investigation, Miriam sat very still for a very long time. Joshua walked through the door at 7:15. He found his wife seated at the dining table. He found, across from her, the woman he had told to be patient. He found them both looking at him with identical expressions of total clarity. There is no elegant way to describe what happened next. He tried several approaches in rapid succession: anger, denial, a bizarre attempt at calm explanation, but Janet had spent 12 years studying the specific texture of his manipulations, and she was no longer inside them. She was outside looking in, and what she saw was not frightening. It was just small. "You can stay in the hotel you've been using," she told him. "Your things will be in the front yard by tomorrow morning. The divorce papers will be filed Thursday." He said things, many things, escalating things, but Janet had already stopped listening. She was done listening to Joshua Harry. The papers were filed Thursday, as promised. Grace Tendo, who had seen most things in 20 years of family law, said she had rarely seen a financial case as thoroughly documented as the one Janet brought her. The asset concealment alone, 3 offshore accounts, 2 properties registered under a shell company, the systematic stripping of their joint investments over 22 months amounted to fraud that reached well beyond civil court. The life insurance policy, combined with the communications on the burner phone, attracted the attention of a detective named Samuel Uma, who had been looking for exactly this kind of pattern. A few more weeks, the message had said. Detective Uma was very interested in what, specifically, was supposed to happen in a few more weeks. What unraveled over the next 6 weeks was a case that expanded far beyond one marriage. Joshua Harry, it emerged, had done this before. Not the murder part at least, not conclusively, not yet, but the financial excavation, the grooming of a replacement, the patient construction of a new life on the bones of the old one. A woman named Patricia, whom he had been briefly engaged to 8 years prior, had left that relationship financially devastated and unable to fully explain why. She had spent years feeling ashamed, feeling stupid. She came forward when she saw the news reports. Her testimony described a pattern so consistent with Janet's experience that it was almost like a script. Detective Uma noted that Joshua Harry was not improvising. He had a method. He had simply believed each time that the woman he'd chosen was too invested, too isolated, too in love to see clearly until it was too late. He had not accounted for Janet's hands. He had not accounted for the fact that a woman who has spent 23 years reading financial documents can recognize, in the architecture of a deception, the exact moment things are designed to happen. He had not accounted for Miriam, whom he discarded and who sat in that courtroom 8 months later with her infant daughter asleep in a carrier against her chest and told the court everything she knew. He had not accounted for Brenda, who had spent years being quietly dismissed as times a bit much times, and who arrived at every court date in a different bright dress and held Janet's hand in the hallway each morning. He had not accounted for Patricia, who had waited 8 years to be believed and who gave her testimony in a voice that did not shake once. Joshua Harry was charged with fraud, financial abuse, and based on the insurance policy, the timeline, and the communications on the burner phone conspiracy. His lawyer argued that the messages were ambiguous, that times a few more weeks times referred to his plan to come clean about the affair. The jury considered this argument for approximately 4 hours. Guilty on the fraud charges, guilty on the financial abuse, guilty on the conspiracy charge. He sat very still when they read the verdicts, each one dropping into the silence of that courtroom like stones into deep water. Janet watched his face. She had wondered, in quiet moments, whether she would feel anything watching this. What she felt was simply the confirmation of something she had already known. She felt, more than anything, tired. And then, underneath the tiredness, something she recognized after a moment as relief. The sentencing was 17 years. His mother, who had called Janet times, oversensitive times, when she'd first confided her early concerns, sat in the gallery and wept. Janet watched her too, with something that was not quite sympathy and not quite its absence. That woman had known her son. She had known something. Janet hoped she would carry that knowledge with her for a long time. There was a period afterward, months, that Janet will tell you was the strangest of her life. Not the worst, not the hardest, the strangest. The practical crisis was over, but the internal one was still running its course, the way a fever breaks before the weakness lifts. She had lived inside one version of herself for 12 years, the version that was Joshua's wife, that accommodated and managed and kept her hands steady and her concerns internal, and that version was over. She wasn't sure who was underneath. She stood in front of the bathroom mirror some mornings and did not recognize the woman looking back. The face was the same. The eyes were different. I don't know who I am without this, she said to herself once out loud, and then stood there listening to the words land. And then she said, well, let's find out. She found out slowly, the way all real things are found. She called Brenda Moore. She went back to her sister's house for the first time in years and sat in her childhood kitchen and ate the food she'd grown up with and felt, in the ordinariness of it, something releasing. She went back to work and found that her colleagues, who had watched the case unfold in the news with various degrees of alarm and fascination, treated her neither like a victim nor a celebrity, but simply like herself, like Janet, who was exceptionally good at finding what people tried to hide in numbers. She worked a full week, then a month, then the work simply became normal again, which was a form of healing she hadn't anticipated. Miriam she saw occasionally, cautiously, in the way of two people who share a strange geography and are still figuring out what it means. The baby, a girl named Amara, was 10 months old the last time Janet saw her, pulling herself upright against a coffee table and very pleased about it. Janet held her for a few minutes. She felt the warm, specific weight of a child who was innocent of every choice that had brought her into the world, and she thought, at least this one small, irreducible good had come out of it. Miriam was rebuilding. She had family. She was going to be all right. Janet sold the house. She bought a smaller one, a place with a garden she intended to actually use, in a neighborhood where she knew people and people knew her. She checked the locks when she came home in the evenings. For the first few months, she checked them 3 times. Then 2. The morning she checked them only once and walked away without going back. She stood in her kitchen and noticed that she'd done it and then made herself coffee and didn't think about it again for the rest of the day. That was progress. That was what healing actually looks like, not dramatic and declared, but small and cumulative and easy to miss if you're not paying attention. She started speaking publicly about financial abuse in intimate partnerships because it turned out there was significant need for someone who could explain, in plain language, exactly how this kind of thing works, the account structures, the asset transfers, the patterns that are designed to be invisible until the moment they are too large to escape. She had spent her whole career finding what people hid in numbers. Now she was teaching other people how to look. She spoke at women's organizations, at law schools, at a conference in Nairobi where she stood at a podium and said, clearly and without drama, financial control is the infrastructure of coercive abuse. If you cannot see the money, you cannot see the trap. She said it and watched people writing it down and felt something she would eventually learn to call purpose. Joshua, Harry, as of the last piece of news that reached her, was in the 3rd year of his sentence. He had filed 2 appeals, both unsuccessful. His legal fees had consumed what remained of the assets that hadn't been seized or returned to Janet. She did not think about him often. When she did, it was the way you think about a weather system that caused damage years ago. It happened. It was real, but it's not here now, and the sky today is clear. She did not hate him. She had stopped hating him somewhere around the end of the 1st year, not as an act of forgiveness exactly, but as a decision to stop giving him residence inside her. He had taken 12 years. He did not get to take more. She stood at her bathroom mirror one morning, a morning like all the other mornings now, ordinary in hers, coffee cooling on the counter, light coming through the window of the small house with the garden she had planted herself, and she looked at the woman looking back and she recognized her. "Hello, Janet," she said quietly. "Welcome back." And the woman in the mirror looked like someone who had gone very far in a very dark direction and come back carrying everything she'd learned, which, as it turned out, was considerable. She checked the locks once that morning, just once. Then she picked up her coffee and went out to the garden and sat in the early sun, and it was enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. It was a life. It was her life, and she had built every single piece of it herself.